W.B. Yeats. I must be gone. There is a grave where daffodil and lily wave, and I would please the hapless fawn, buried under the sleep ground, with mirthful songs before the dawn. His shouting days with mirth were crowned, and I still dream he treads the lawn, walking ghostly in the dew, pierced by my glad singing through. This is Stephen E. Andrews, Outlaw Bookseller, and we're talking about why Philip K. Dick's Our Friends from Frolix 8 is more important than everybody thinks it is. Hi and welcome back to the channel. We've done a lot of Philip K. Dick recently, and just doing one clip about the way I feel you should approach the Valis trilogy led me to Lies Inc. And it got me thinking again about one of my favourite PKD books, admittedly a flawed one, but a favourite one, and one I feel is really underrated, and that's Our Friends from Frolix 8. This is my original Granada copy, which I bought way back in the early 80s, terribly spine faded now, but I've always loved that cover by Jim Burns. I mean, Jim's a great artist anyway. I hope to interview Jim one day. He doesn't live too far from me, and I know him on social media, so I must get in touch and ask him. So Jim, if you're watching, I'm going to be coming your way soon, I hope. That is actually, you know, a good representation of the climax of the book, as bizarre as it looks. So we'll talk about that now. And why did I start with a quotation from W.B. Yeats? Well, we'll come to that. But first of all, I just want to talk about Frolix as a science fiction novel, its plot, its characters and what have you, and begin that way and we'll get into it. This is the Canal edition from the late 80s. I think it's 89. This was the UK first hardcover edition, yeah, 89, by arrangement with Grafton Books, because Granada had become Grafton by that point. And first UK hardcover. And this was run off by Canal, as I say, small press, did some great stuff. They came in the wake of Kerosena. You might have seen my Kerosena video the other day, which goes into Philip K. Dick, John Brunner, Keith Roberts, lots of great SF that they published. So this is a Canal one. I used to sell this back in the day. Really, really great. Regarded as a minor novel by many people. And it came out in 1970, and by this point Dick had produced, you know, quite a few masterpieces in the 60s. He produced The Man in the High Castle, won the Hugo Award. He produced the sublime Martian Time Slip, the magnificent Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, Ubik, the Three Stigmata of Palmer Eldritch. He did some minor books as well. He was having a hard time in the 70s. You know, he had several partners by that point, several wives. He got more involved with drugs. He was thinking more about his philosophy. And this is important because this is the first book in which Dick's religious concerns begin to be mentioned. So for that alone, it is quite significant. The basic plot, a dystopian novel, is set about 150 years from now, and the world has changed. It's now run by two different groups of superpowered mutants, which is a classic Dickian theme inherited from Van Vogt's Slan and Henry Kuttner's Mutant, those things from back in the Golden Age and just after. And basically there are the new men who have what you call Rogers nodes on their brains. They have new organs, and they are simply intellectually way, way beyond ordinary people who are in the so-called undermen. And there's also a smaller group called unusuals, and unusuals have specific abilities like telepathy, which make them very useful. So there's a kind of sort of uneasy alliance politically between the new men, the super-brained mutants, who are sort of pushing forward, particularly in theoretical science and theoretical philosophy and mathematics, and the unusuals. And the guy who runs the World Council is a guy called Graham, and Graham is a very, very unpleasant figure. He's a real Hitler type, and most of the time when he's in the book, he's one of sort of half a dozen main protagonists. He just dictates from his bed, and he's just all the way through saying things like, oh, have this person shot, what have you. The dynamic in the plot comes from this, in that a ordinary Underman from Earth called Thor's Pravoni has been fighting back against the new men and the unusuals, and he's going to go off into space in a spaceship which is called the Grey Dinosaur, and he vows that he's going to bring help from another world. So he goes off with this hubristic idea about bringing aliens back to Earth to somehow help the cause of the Undermen, the ordinary oppressed people who are being sort of pushed into sort of labour camps and what have you, and they have to go undergo tests when they're adolescents to see whether they are new men or unusuals or ordinary, because if you're ordinary you just end up in a dead-end job. So Thor's Pravoni is this initially off-camera figure with this bizarre idea about bringing aliens back to Earth to help out in the cause of the Undermen. So it's a kind of anti-evolutionary thing, and there's a tie in that, I think, to John Wyndham's work, which was all about social Darwinism and mutation and what was the right thing to do in a situation. And I'm going to do a Wyndham video when I cover the Midwich Cuckoos and the Chrysalids and compare and contrast the two of my favourite books, because he looks at the same thing from different angles, and Dick does that himself as well several times through the course of his books, and this one I think is particularly underrated. One of the main characters is a young man called Nick Appleton. I say he's young, he's approaching middle age. He's got a wife called Cleo. Interestingly, one of Dick's wives was called Cleo, but spelt differently. He has a young son called Bobby, and Bobby is about to take a test to determine whether he's a new man, and Nick is very concerned about this because Nick wants to see him rise in society. He knows really that Bobby isn't a new man. Alcohol's illegal and smoking's illegal, but you know, you can take drugs in a drug bar. So all throughout the book people are popping amphetamines and what have you, which is typical of the kind of thing that Dick was doing to stay up all night to write, you know, as early as the 1950s. So it is quite a druggy book in that sense as well. Nick gets involved with this. He finds out that his employer is involved with the revolutionary movement, which is going to overthrow or try and overthrow the new men and the unusuals when Thor's Pravoni comes back with help from outer space, which seems a very outlandish idea. He also gets involved with a dark-haired girl, and this is something which is in Philip K. Dick's life from this book onwards. There is actually a book called The Dark-Haired Girl, which is a non-fiction book. Of course, Tessa, Dick's last wife, was dark-haired, and Dick seemed to get very obsessed with this idea of intense, sometimes unpleasantly violent, young, dark-haired, thin women. That's not to say that Tessa was like that, she obviously wasn't, but that seems to have been a thing for him. So we're seeing the beginning of the religious thing, we're seeing his obsession with the dark-haired girl, we're seeing the drugs, and we're seeing a narrative which at the time did seem a bit out of date. The thing with Frolix doesn't have the same sort of texture and depth of books like Androids and Martian Timeslip. It has a more strident, harsh, hurried tone. Several of the characters are very unpleasant in this book, and Dick, you know, wasn't afraid of doing unpleasant characters, but there really are some quite nasty ones. I've mentioned Graham, and he becomes obsessed with this girl Charlotte, who is the dark-haired girl who Nick gets involved with outside his marriage, who's a very rapacious character. Graham is always sort of snaffling amphetamines, rather like the Nazis used to. You know, they were all off their heads on drugs. There's a book about it called Blitzed. He talks about making Charlie, he calls her, into his little fish, which is a reference to the Emperor Tiberius, when Tiberius lived on the island of Capri in the last 10 years of his life and ruled Rome, and thus the known world from there. I think it was Suetonius claimed that, you know, Tiberius was really depraved, and that he had this pool at one of the palaces on Capri. I've actually been there, where he would have little boys swim underneath between his legs and nibble at him. So that's sort of comparing Graham to Tiberius, and you know, there's that reference there. There's another character called Denny who's quite unpleasant. One does feel for Nick Appleton. He's a classic Dickian little man, you know, but he's a good focus character, which does suit the dystopian situation, and it does suit the pacing of the plot, because there's some horrible things go on. One of the lead characters on Earth, who's part of the Undermen movement, who is writing subversive literature, he's dealt with very harshly. It's an interesting one, because There are lots of things from the past in the book, and yet there are things from the future, and I just want to run through some of them. It's no surprise that, you know, the alien does eventually show up with Provoni. There is a secret about Provoni, which is a fantastic bit of conceptual breakthrough writing, the sort of writing that makes real SF, and I can't really say enough good about that. I'm not going to give you a spoiler on that front. And the alien turns up, and he made me think, when I first read this book, of an alien who appears slightly later in a slightly later date book, the Glimmer in Galactic Pot Healer. He also made me think of the Lord Running Clam from Clans of the Alphane Moon, which is a few years before Frolix 8. Aliens are often used as kind of almost jokey figures in Dick. You also get this thing where there's these throwaway mentions of what people are wearing, and it's always absurd, but Dick does it very, very eloquently. He'll describe somebody as wearing a drawstring blouse and balloon trousers, and that's it, and straight away you know what he means. But he's bringing this element of the absurd in. But of course, fashions are absurd in retrospect, so why shouldn't the fashions of the future be absurd as well? It's also part of what I believe the critic Peter Fitting wrote in a wonderful essay called The Deconstruction of Bourgeois SF, which is about Ubik, and he writes about how in Ubik Dick throws out all these sort of descriptions of what the characters are wearing, and there's a lot of them in Ubik, and he says about how they are there to cognitively disassociate you, but also to sort of mock conventional Manifest Destiny, Golden Age SF, in the idea that everything's very serious and stentorian, and that it's just a joke, and to undermine the idea that SF has to be rational and everything has to fit together. Dick was more interested in things falling apart, of course, and Ubik is a classic example of that. We do have this rather taut narrative, not as well written as the better novels of the 1960s, but we are seeing things moving forward. When a Frolixian first appears in the book, there is a mention by a character of the Ideos Cosmos, which was something Dick was interested in and comes up a lot in Valis and later on. And he talks about God, and there's a discussion between him and the Frolixian, I believe, about a being which is found deceased in space, a large alien thing, which it's been scientifically proved it could have created planets and people on them and what have you. And at the same time, Provoni is sort of suggesting that the Frolixians are God and they're going to come and help. So they're kind of angelic, even though they don't look anything like aliens. And Dick's very clever because he teases you with what their real sort of physical appearance is, and that's revealed later on in the book. Very, very subtly and deftly drawn, but not in any great detail, because it's not important. What is important is the idea. One of the questions is, why would the friends from Frolix 8 wish to save the undermen, the ordinary people? The cause of evolution is different. The new men and the unusuals have evolved, arguably artificially. There's some suggestions of that in the book. But of course, it's interesting because the friend from Frolix says to Thor's Provoni that they value quaintness, uniqueness, and, you know, the simple things in life. So that's an interesting point about the caring aspect of the book. And as I say, the religious stuff comes through very, very strongly. And I'm going to read you a little bit now from the climax of the book. And this is when one of the new men, Amos Ild, who is a monstrous, strange being, is brought down to the level of a child. I have here a little diary which I edited back in 1998. It was a diary for 1999, a literary diary for a book-selling company. And there was a theme, which is the theme of identity. And each day there's a little literary anniversary and there's a quotation each day. And I picked these out, and it was a great fun project. And there's various things throughout the book, and I put some quotations in. And I chose to put a moment in from Frolix 8 because I felt it was really, really important. And there's the illustration there. And I did pretty much everything on these, apart from the actual design, which is done by a design firm. So I'm just going to read you a bit now. Can God fly? Denfield asked. Can he hold out his arms and fly? Yes, she said. Someday, he broke off, I think every little thing will fly, or anyhow trudge or run. Some will go fast like they do in this life, but most will fly or trudge, up and up, forever. Even slugs and snails. They'll go very slow, but they'll make it. Sometime. All of them will make it eventually, no matter how slow they go. Leaving a lot behind, that has to be done. You think so? Yes, she said. A very great lot behind. Thank you, Danfield said. For what? For giving me God. What that reading does is show the classic Christian thing about humility and love being important, and letting everything complex go, and just, you know, embracing God and what have you, coming forward. So that's a sort of very direct thing. So it's a very humble thing. And, you know, Frolix is very much a book of wish fulfillment. It's about wanting to overturn a dystopia easily. It feels very Deus Ex, and of course it is, because you know, Provoni brings back a virtual god in the form of the Frolixian from the stars. It's a fast-paced narrative. It's a great read, but it is very abrasive, as I said. It doesn't have that smoothness of texture that you get, as I say, in novels like Androids and Martian Time Slip. Fantastic stuff. So I go back to it quite regularly and reread it, and always really enjoy it. So I would say, I would argue really that maybe you should do the same. Look at it again. If you haven't read it, pick it up and read it. It is quite important. On the W.B. Yeats front, that comes up when Nick Appleton is with Charlie, and he is in Central Park. What's left of it is just reduced to a tiny little piece of grass, and he's never actually walked on grass before. It's a classic bit of great dystopian writing. And he talks about the poem, and Charlie says, you know, is that before Dylan? And of course Dylan, of course, was obviously still with us, Nobel Prize winner, but then Dylan had only been, you know, well known for about 6 or 7 years. You know, he broke through in the 60s, and obviously he was a huge phenomenon. And of course Dick didn't know that he was eventually going to win the Nobel Prize for Literature. Pity Philip K. Dick didn't, but of course once you're dead you can't. That's the trouble. And Nick quotes that poem, and I always think about it because Dick liked to put those sort of things in epigraphs. There's some very moving epigraphs in some of his books, and the bit that always gets me is the end of it, which Nick Appleton doesn't utter out loud to Charlie when he's reading the poem. He's from memory, because it affects him too much, and he says it affects him too much internally, and that's pierced by my glad singing through. And I guess that's a religious thing again, the sort of joy in the acceptance of God. And obviously Dick was a Christian. I'm not. I'm not a believer. Am I an agnostic? I don't think I am. I think I'm just an atheist. But it is very moving. And those lines, you know, it just shows you what you can do with a strong biblical or poetic reference in fiction. And I always think of Nick Appleton in that moment, a man who's fallen out with his wife. He's got involved with this woman, and he is going to be a target of Graham. He's one of the undermen. His life is at risk. His son, sadly, sort of falls out of the narrative, which is a great shame. And eventually he gets to confront Amos Ild, the ultimate new man, and witnesses the denouement of the book, which I read a little piece of, and it's just very moving. And I always think of Nick Appleton in that tiny part of Central Park near the climax of the book, pierced by his glad singing through. This is Outlaw Bookseller with Our Friends from Frolix 8. Not a minor Dick novel, it's a great Dick novel. It may not be as strong in a literary sense in terms of the prose style as the others, but it's really important. And pick it up and read it, and maybe you'll be pierced by that glad singing through as well. Bye for now.